So anyway, let's make a start. Welcome to our panelists. So we've got Jonathan Brooks from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Oxford. Hello. We've got Max Gatti, who's currently based at Northwestern University in Chicago. So thank you. It's probably quite early where you are. We've got Ria Bernard, who's the Chief Executive of Action for Stammering Children. And I'm a trustee of your charity. I know the amazing work that you do. And we've also got Kate Watkins, who's a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of Oxford. So welcome to you all. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the work you've been doing. And I was actually going to start with Kate, if that's all right, because I came to Oxford in January and saw some of the incredible work that you have been doing. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about it. I know quite a lot of the work you've done has been about MRI imaging of the brain. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. I think for more than a decade now, nearly two, actually, we've been using MRI brain scans to look inside the brain at what happens to brain function when someone is speaking in the scanner. So we do this with all kinds of people, including people who stammer. And also we use the MRI to take really detailed pictures of the brain structure. So that tells us whether there are differences in the size and shape of different brain areas, and then quite importantly, how those brain areas are connected and how they talk to each other.
And what do you, because as someone who stammered, I've always wanted to know what actually causes it, and I've been told it's a neurological condition. What kind of things do you see when you do that kind of research?
Well, so I think the evidence for that statement is the brain imaging work, but of course we can't be certain what causes it and what might have occurred in the brain as a consequence of having a developmental stuttering difficulty during childhood. So, I think that the evidence from my work and from other people who've scanned children who stammer is really actually surprisingly convergent in that it agrees that there are some differences in the ways that the brain is connected. So in the brain, you have areas that are responsible for listening to speech, and there are different areas that are responsible for producing speech. So to put it simply, the connections between those areas that are quite important for sort of monitoring your speech as you produce it do seem to be less well connected in people who stammer compared with people who are typically fluent, who in science terms we call controls. I might end up saying controls, and that's what I'm referring to. So yeah, our imaging has shown that there are differences in how well connected. It's not like there's an area of damage or there's a brain lesion or anything like that that explains stammering, but that there is this weakness in the connections that mean that the signals probably have to be very strong to get through, and when they're not very strong, they might break down, and so that would perhaps interrupt the speech flow, which ties in with the experience of people who stammer.
That's really interesting. And so what if that is the case, how could that potentially help future kind of treatment or techniques to kind of increase fluency for people who want to do so?
Well, actually, yeah, we know that things like brain training works so that we can increase these connections. We can improve the connections between brain areas through training, so through massed practice, that sort of thing. We also know in my lab that we can help that kind of training, because this is hard to do. It requires probably a lot of practice. We can help that by using brain stimulation at the same time. So in adults who stammer, where there actually aren't that many opportunities for interventions, some people want to work on their fluency, and for those we have had some positive results in using brain stimulation to speed up the effects of training interventions. So you may know that people who stammer can speak fluently if they speak in time with a metronome, or if they read something that someone else is reading. That's called choral speaking. So when they speak in with these what are called fluency enhancers, we can put people who stammer into a fluent state, and while they're speaking fluently for say 20 minutes, we give them a very mild amount of electrical stimulation across the scalp. And this has been shown in our studies, but in other studies with all kinds of training programs, to speed up the effects of that kind of training and make them last for longer once we take that stimulation away. So we did this in a trial with about 30 people who stutter, and we found that the effects of 5 days of training with brain stimulation brought about a 1/3 symptom reduction. So about a third of the stammering symptoms we saw in people were reduced after just 5 days. And that effect lasted for another 6 weeks after we'd finished the training.
Another 6 weeks. It's quite amazing, isn't it?
I mean, we'd stopped it after that. We could have gone on for longer, I don't know, but we only had money to keep measuring this in the first 6 weeks. So yeah, it was very promising. It's not, it's not ever as simple as that. There are lots of things that we still need to work out as to what the best kind of regime for this kind of stimulation is, and it might not work for everybody. So it might be important to try and understand who it works for and who it doesn't work for.
Absolutely. And another thing I saw when I came to visit you was work with virtual reality as well. That was really interesting. And that was kind of investigating why people seem to stammer less when they're on their own, which I think a lot of people who stammer can relate to. You find sometimes you can speak fluently when you're on your own. What have the results kind of shown for that so far?
So I think we're still in the process of analysing those data. So my graduate student, Bertrand Demirel, is working on that. But he tells me sort of anecdotally that it is very effective, that speaking on your own, asking people to read something on their own works very well for most people. I think, again, it can't be said to be true for everybody. And the idea, I think, with the virtual reality really would be to try and so maybe the kind of metronome timed speech I talked about, where you speak in time with the metronome or choral reading, isn't necessarily going to produce the most natural sounding speech. So with virtual reality, we might be able to put somebody into a communication setting and support them in a way that allows them to be fluent and give them the brain stimulation then. So we would be trying to promote this more naturalistic way of speaking. So that's, but first of all, it's the sort of all these baby steps we need to take in science. So first of all, we need to show that the VR situation would work, or find out the ideal VR environment for people. And then we need to couple that with the best kind of stimulation that works for the brain stimulation as well.
Absolutely. And you mentioned just before we came online that with your MRI imaging at the moment, you're also doing something that's looking at the vocal tract as well.
Yeah, so if you imagine that we could just look inside your head with an MRI scanner, which we can do, and if we took a picture of you like in profile, we'd be able to see all of the parts of the vocal tract, going from, the lips, teeth, tongue, the palate, the soft palate, down to the larynx in the throat. And we can see all of that moving at the same time using what's called real-time MRI. So it's like a video of someone speaking. If you Google it, you'll find all kinds of videos of vocal tract imaging. And this has allowed us to see for the first time what's happening inside the vocal tract of people who stammer when they are stammering. But we're even seeing that actually when people are inside the MRI scanner, they're mostly fluent, so they don't stammer often. And even during those perceptibly fluent speech utterances, we're still able to measure differences. And it seems that the speech is not as stable. The movements used to produce speech are not as stable in those individuals as they are in our control group, our fluent speakers. So
it's really interesting, and it's kind of really reassuring to know this kind of work is going on as well, to try and find out more about stammering. I'm just interested as well, what made you kind of, because you've done so much about stammering or stuttering, I should say, which is another name for it. What was it that made you want to do this kind of research?
Yeah, so I started off doing research. I started off working actually at Great Ormond Street Hospital with children who had kind of neurological problems. So they might have had epilepsy or brain tumors, that sort of thing. And I was always interested in their language. And then when I was doing my PhD, I worked with a family that had a genetic problem that caused their speech and language difficulties. But that genetic mutation that causes their difficulties is very, very rare. But it affected a part of the brain that is involved in motor control generally. So this part of the brain is called the basal ganglia, but that's the part of the brain that actually we know is important for the control of movement through disorders like Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. So not many people have paid attention to its role in speech until, maybe recently, well, maybe 20 years ago, people started to pay attention to the role of this part of the brain in speech. And someone else had done some research with people who stutter that had highlighted, again, this same kind of set of structures that control movement. And I knew that stuttering is much more common than the kinds of problems I was working on for my PhD. And so I thought that the skills I'd acquired to look at the brain in that training could be usefully applied then to stuttering. And I am a little bit I get distracted easily. So I'm also interested in another developmental language disorder is called, which is more of a language than a speech difficulty that many children experience during early years at school. So I've been working on that recently as well.
That sounds really exciting. It's really good to know. Thank you very much. I was just going to move on to Max now, because Max, actually talking to Kate, it sounds like you've done quite kind of similar types of research, or when she was talking about choral reading, is that something kind of similar to what you've been doing? It's looking at sensory inputs, which are additional to your own speech.
Yes, so what I've been looking at is kind of complementary to what Kate's been talking about, in that when we think about stuttering, it's obviously a speech production problem. The person is wanting to talk and the speech isn't being produced in the way that we want. But the other thing that happens while you're talking is that you hear yourself talking. And indeed, you can't talk without hearing yourself talking. So you can also conceive of stuttering as a speech perception problem, and really perception and production are entwined. You can't really separate the two. So what I've done on my PhD and what I'm working on currently is the way that speech perception works and how that interacts with speech production. So we find that speech perception, when people are talking and they hear themselves, it's multisensory, and that happens really quite early on. So you get this combination. Obviously, the sounds coming through the ear are a big part of it, but there's also the sort of somatosensory feedback as well from the speech muscles. And what I looked in particular at in my PhD was the vestibular sensation that people have while they're talking. This hasn't been researched much historically, but it's really quite well established now that the vestibular system responds to sound, particularly to what's called bone conducted or body conducted sound. So when we're speaking, the speech energy is created here in the larynx, and it kind of spreads through up into the ears, through the neck, and up through the head that way. And it turns out there's about half of the sound that we're hearing while we're talking is coming kind of round the head and into the ear, just like you're hearing me at the moment through your headphones or computer speakers or whatever. And about half of the sound that we hear when we're talking is traveling through the center of the neck and up into the head that way. So that when we hear ourselves, it's about a 50-50 split between these two. But the vestibular system, which is a part of the ear which has traditionally been thought of as being used for balance because it is used for that, also responds to those sounds and responds really quite strongly. So there've been a couple of tests of the vestibular system in people who stutter. One was done in the 1970s, and they put people into a chair and span them round, and there was a speech task and a non-speech task, and you can kind of see how that works by looking at the eye movements of people after you've been spinning them around in a chair. And there's a difference between people who do and who don't stutter when you do this. And with the research that I did in my PhD, I looked at something called the vestibular evoked myogenic potential, which is where you put sensors onto people and kind of record the vestibular system through an indirect method. And what I found was that the vestibular response is weaker in people who stutter than people who don't stutter. So it's as if we have to talk twice as loud as people who don't stutter in order to have the same vestibular experience. So that was my PhD. And I kind of reached the limit of what's possible in human participants in the PhD. So I'm now doing the same research, but using an animal model instead. So this will eventually lead to work on the stuttering mouse. And I'll be looking at a load of stuff that we can't really do in humans because it just isn't possible, but it is in a mouse. Yeah.
That's really interesting what you say. People who stammer are kind of, having to try twice as hard to kind of speak as well. That's fascinating. What are you hoping this research will kind of show? The research you're doing at the moment. What are you hoping will come as a result of that?
What I'm looking at is there's been quite a lot of work on the genetics of stuttering. And with the animal models of stuttering, it's possible to kind of subtype the stuttering based on the genetics. So in humans who stutter, the genetic contribution is going to be lots of things. It's really complicated. But what's possible to do in the animal research is to look at just one gene at a time and work out exactly what that gene is doing. I'm looking as well at kind of how speech is identified. So, I mean, this is kind of wider than just the stuttering, but the stuttering case is really interesting because I think that when we're learning how to speak, like there's a lot of children who have a sort of transient period of stuttering, and it coincides with the language learning. Like when kids are starting to speak in full sentences, aged about 3 or 4, that's when a lot of the stuttering's happening. And it's kind of tied into the Vygotsky sort of private speech thing, in that children, if you're around children of that age, they do a lot of talking to themselves. And what I think is happening is that when children in general are sort of learning how to speak, there's a change from the private to the inner speech where you start sort of thinking in sentences. And I think that process is working a little differently in the children who stutter. If there's a slight delay, then there'll be the transient stuttering. If the delay is happening for longer and the child becomes aware of the difficulty speaking, then the stuttering can continue into adulthood like it's done for me.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's what we're kind of told as people who stutter, don't we? If you kind of you get to a stage where your brain kind of registers it in a weird way, or you have negative experiences, then it tends to stay with you into adulthood, which I've always thought is really interesting. Yeah. So what made you want to do this research? You have personal experience of stuttering as well, don't you?
Yeah, so I started off, I'd worked in the private sector for a while, and then I thought, well, actually, I want to go back and do academic work, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I went into the philosophy department to start with, because that's really good if you don't know exactly what you want to do. And I kind of saw all the work they were doing. They were really interested in autism because it kind of ties into the philosophy of mind. And I thought, oh, perhaps they'd be interested in stuttering as well. And they were like, yeah, do stuff on stuttering. So I then came up with sort of a hypothesis of stuttering, which is really similar to the Sheen approach avoidance conflict, except that I think we're sort of paying too much attention to our own speech, but we're doing it unconsciously. So we're sort of reinterpreting our own speech while we're speaking, which is not something you'd ordinarily want to do, because you kind of know what you want to say and you're just going to say it. So I've got a prediction that the stuttering is going to coincide with any time that we're uncertain about what we're saying. And I thought that was pretty good. And I thought, how can I test this? And then I thought, oh, that's really going to be difficult in psycholinguistics. But I also had a prediction in that hypothesis that people who stutter should be hearing their own speech differently to people who don't stutter, which then led me to think, how do people identify their own speech in general? And no one's really researched that. So that kind of led to all of the research I've done ever since on how people in general identify their speech, and keeping the group of people who stutter as an experimental group so that we can compare and work out how speech perception in general works.
And why do you think it's important that we do this kind of research?
It's important just for understanding how humans work, how speech perception works. That's just important in general. It's a basic science thing. So a lot of the stuttering research that you see is largely because people want to understand how the human body works, and stuttering is really interesting because there is just the stuttering, and when you look at people who stutter, there's not much else that's happening in them that's unusual apart from the stuttering. So you're thinking, why is that stuttering there? And if it's possible to understand why the stuttering is happening, then we can understand a whole load of other stuff as well.
It's so true. Thank you. It's fascinating. Right, Jonathan, thank you for waiting so patiently. I'm really interested to talk to you because I understand you have a covert stammer, which is the same as me. For people who don't know what that is, that means we kind of avoid certain words in certain situations, often have high levels of fluency. And is that kind of what you've been looking at in terms of researching into stammering?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to say that I'm really grateful to be on such an amazing panel, especially with some scholars that I personally admire. Yeah, so actually, the more fundamental question I'm interested in my research is, what is stammering more generally? But then, of course, I think part of answering that question is looking at the breadth of different experiences of stuttering, including covert stammering or stuttering. I think I should probably take a step back and say that one thing that makes my research quite different from the two speakers that have gone on before me is the fact that I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to try to claim to be one. I'm coming at this from a philosophical perspective. I'm a philosopher of psychiatric medicine with an emphasis on stammering disorder. So the methods I'll be using are non-empirical methods, and I'm asking a really basic but really important fundamental question: what is this thing that we're talking about when we're talking about stammering disorder? And since you asked about the covert stammering, I'll probably just sort of lay out how I got into this from my own personal experience. So I grew up with, I'd say, an overt stammering disorder. I began to notice myself doing repetitions, so repeating on certain sounds and syllables and words. And over time, I sort of developed different techniques for being able to speak more fluently or more precisely to avoid a stammer when I felt the sensation coming up. Got quite skillful at doing so. And I suppose the thinking was, if I can just avoid appearing disfluent, I could avoid stammering in the ear of the listener, then my problems would all just disappear, that will go away. And what I found actually was that in some ways, the problems just morphed, in other ways, they intensified, in the sense that once you sort of deal with what you can describe as the biological or behavioral or the symptoms that are observable from the third person perspective, you still have to deal with the psychosocial aspects too. So part of what was in the background of me wanting to appear more fluent with the emotional aspects, for example, fear, anxiety, and probably worst of all in my case, the shame. I felt a lot of shame and embarrassment about the way I was speaking and communicating. And that didn't just go away once I'd stopped overtly stammering. Actually, kind of morphed into the fear that I've been speaking so fluently, so if I do now stammer, I'm going to be found out as an imposter, a fraud. I'll be exposed for the stammerer I truly am. And all of those thoughts and feelings and emotions that I have around the stammer are just waiting behind the next door, essentially. So that's what kind of led me into thinking more carefully, maybe philosophically, about what stammering really is. We've heard talk already about sort of the biological dimension of stammering disorder. My research wants to consider the various dimensions of stammering disorder, the biological, the sociological, the psychological, and even the existential, and kind of look at how these things might fit together. So that's just an insight into what I'm interested in and how I got there.
It's really interesting. How strong do you think the connection is, in a way, between the mind and the stammer? Because I'd say certainly in my personal experience, they're very, very connected.
Well, I think one thing that philosophers like to do is to make distinctions, and there's already a distinction that I want to sort of make explicit, which is the distinction between stammering and stammering disorder. So to stammer in and of itself is part of normal speech. To stammer is just to have a disfluency, maybe a repetition here or there. There's nothing really dramatic about that. But when you have a stammering disorder, that speaks to having experiencing stress or distress from the way that you speak. And my favorite comparison is if you think about somebody like, I'm sure everybody knows of someone who speaks quite disfluently. And for me, I think about President Obama, who is heralded as this great orator, this effective speaker. And as a person who's like hypersensitive to speech disfluencies, all I hear are the fillers, the umming and the ahhing, the repetitions in his speech. That's stammering, but it's not a stammering disorder because it doesn't cause him or anybody else around him any distress or stress. So to your question about the mind aspect, I think part of what makes it a stammering disorder is how do you relate to those disfluencies? In fact, I've once joked that I don't think we should really call it a stammering disorder, but it's more so a maybe shame in relation to my disfluencies disorder to maybe capture the psychosocial aspect a bit more, because I think the psychological aspect of the mind plays a really significant role in what it means to have a stammering disorder. And one other point I'll add to this is actually when you have border cases, maybe I'll make 2 points. When you have border cases where you come to a therapist or psychiatrist and you said, I've got a stammering disorder, but you are fairly fluent, often in making that diagnosis between a fluent or a stammerer or a person who stammers, the therapist has to defer to the, you might say, testimony of the individual, because if they feel as though they've got this problem, then that has diagnostic and clinical implications. And just building on that point, I think the subcategory of, if you want to put it that way, of covert stammerers, I think speaks to the importance of the psychological aspect, because sometimes you can be completely fluent. Like maybe you compare the way that I'm speaking now to Obama, but when I speak, I'm maybe hyper reflexive and self-monitoring constantly, and I'm having a difficult time while speaking. He's being quite disfluent, but having a great time. That shows that there's a bit more going on than just what's on the surface.
It's really interesting what you say about that feeling of shame, and kind of your greatest fear being revealed as a person who stammered as well. I think it's because so much of it is under the surface, isn't it? Like they use the idea of an iceberg, that you only see a little bit at the top, but everything that's kind of going on in the mind of someone who's living with stammering.
Absolutely, I think that analogy is so apt. And I actually came across that first when I was in therapy with one of the world leaders in the area of covert stammering. Carolyn Cheeseman, I think she prefers the term interiorized stammering. And the week that we learned about the iceberg, we were asked to write down sort of on the top what things people see, above the water and below the things that you experience, and the thoughts and things you have about your stammer. And that for me was a huge revelation, because when I began to see the words that I associate with stammering, so unintelligent, ugly, because sometimes when I stammer, I can talk my face or something, I don't know, immature, because it doesn't seem like a man should struggle to be able to articulate himself. All of these negative, really, really difficult and disgusting words I use to describe stammering, suddenly it made so much more sense why I would resort to these coping mechanisms, why I go to such extents to try to cover up and to hide all of these things that I felt were so shameful and so embarrassing. So I think it's a really worthwhile exercise to do, not just theoretically, but also therapeutically for anybody that's can relate to my experience.
And I'm just interested, how do you view your relationship with stammering now, since you have kind of started, you know, investigating it in the way that you have?
So it's still quite troubled, I'd say, but it's a work in progress. So one of the things I was asked to do in my therapy for covert stammer is to actually voluntarily stammer. So you could speak fluently in that moment, but you're choosing to speak this fluency, and that's sort of a form of exposure therapy, essentially. And the difficulties I have with that exercise, I think, reveals to me that there's still quite a tension, that there's, even if I understand intellectually that really stammering is a normal part of speech and it shouldn't really be a huge deal. You can point to examples of people that have quite this speech and they're quite fine with it, even dignified, but there's still, I think, a struggle. And it's because, I think you mentioned earlier on, there's a history, right, of experiences, of meanings, and you can speak on one level in terms of the brain and neuroplasticity, how you can acquire, adapt, and sort of collect these experiences, and it can sort of characterize how you interact with certain contexts. That's the one dimension, but then there's also the psychological level where there's certain meanings. So one thing I find interesting is speaking to other stammerers about how they actually have very different interpretations of the same sorts of contexts. So for me, public speaking is something that I find anxiety-inducing and something I always overly prepare for. Another friend of mine who stammers says that he prefers the public speaking format because he gets a chance to sort of speak in a way that's, he feels like he's in control. No one's going to rush him, as opposed to like a fast-moving conversation. And that speaks to his personal history. My experience, my current experience, and my current difficulty speaks to my history. And I just want to emphasize that it's not just the history of how my brain might have changed, but also I don't think you can get a full explanation of what's going on without the hermeneutic or discussing the psychosocial means that I've acquired. What does it mean for me to do public speaking? For me, perhaps it means an opportunity to fail and to embarrass myself in front of lots of judgmental eyes. For him, perhaps it's a chance to finally be heard, to have my voice to be seen. And that's an important part of the picture.
Absolutely, that's amazing. Thank you very much. It's fascinating to talk to you. Ria, thank you for waiting. Sorry, I'm aware I'm kind of going one by one, but it actually follows on quite well, because talking about the emotional impact that stammering can have on a person. Ria, your research has been into the mental health effect on children and young people who stammer, hasn't it?
It has indeed. Yes, thank you, Felicity. And thank you for inviting me. It's definitely really tricky to follow three fabulous speakers like that. So and thanks for putting up with my spiel. So my research is focused, firstly, I think it's important just to kind of move context in terms of age to children and young people, because there is a difference there. There's a difference insofar as some children who stammer, as Max was talking about, may not stammer as they grow into adulthood, and some will. And there are lots of different factors to consider around social, emotional, and speech and language development in children. So there's a slightly different, I guess, angle that I'm coming from. So my research, yes, Felicity, is investigating, or my PhD research was focused on investigating risk for anxiety and depression in children who stammer relative to children who don't. And I'll just kind of caveat that slightly, that I'm not talking about kind of clinical anxiety and clinical levels of depression, because I'm a speech and language therapist. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but also because I think it's important when we think about that kind of spectrum of anxiety in particular, that anxiety is a normal human response to threat, but when it becomes an issue that's interfering, then that's the problem. And so perhaps in a similar vein to the other speakers, if I just go into Felicity a little bit of why I wanted to look at this.
Please
okay.
do.
Thank you. So I think there were kind of two key reasons for me why I wanted to look at this. The first was that if we go back historically, children who stammer are often kind of grounded, nervous, anxious. They're almost sort of seen as a homogenous, a group of people who are very similar. And working clinically as a speech and language therapist, I mean, that's just not true, which isn't going to be surprising to this audience, but it is remarkable how that can kind of embed itself, but also what impact that can have on those children in terms of self-fulfilling prophecies. And I think that what was really interesting for me was what was the evidence behind that? And there's an awful lot of evidence in adults who stammer and looking at the psychosocial impacts. But for children, there was actually not very much. So you sort of, it was interesting because where was the evidence base for this? And as anyone who knows me knows, evidence base is like my favorite word. So it was frustrating. So I was quite interested to start with at looking at that. And the more I looked into it, the more fascinating it became as to where this association had come from. But the second reason was actually a bit more clinically applicable and more related to kind of thinking about the policy impact. And that's because if we were to find that some children who stammer are more likely to experience anxiety, and anxiety that interferes with their daily lives, we need to put in place structures and interventions that can prevent any longer term adverse impacts on mental health and well-being. And we all know that supporting our mental health and well-being at a younger age sets us up really nicely in terms of resilience as we get older. And in addition to that, I think thinking about factors that might be involved in any association between stammering and anxiety in particular, it helps us to think about what we could do about those factors. So if a child would like to access, and their parents would like to access speech and language therapy, the speech and language therapist would be aware of certain factors that might make that child more at risk to experience adverse mental health, and be able to think about managing that and supporting that child effectively through their management plan. But also, what could we do about some of those wider factors, many of which we can do a lot with for all children, that would also support children who stammer. So in a nutshell, that's why I went into my area.
That's really interesting. How do you kind of identify anxiety in children and young people when you're doing that kind of research?
Felicity, is such an excellent question. And you know what? If we had the whole webinar, or we could just, honestly, give you my thesis. So this was one of the issues that came up through my research. So to begin with, to start the research, I, like many researchers, went back and looked at what had been done before I decided to wade in. And I did that through systematic review and a meta-analysis. So essentially what we're doing there is we're gathering data from a range of different studies that have already looked at anxiety symptoms in children who stammer and children who don't, And then we combine all of those results in order to come up with a kind of summary effect, so a summary result or outcome. And that just gives us a bit more of a I guess, accurate and precise idea of what previous research is saying. And when we did this meta-analysis, what was really interesting was that how anxiety was measured differed so significantly that it was quite difficult to summarise the studies. And so we looked at 13 studies in total in this paper, and we basically found that the way that anxiety is conceptualised, how we see it, how it's perceived, how it's measured, may well impact whether we see a difference between children who stammer and children who don't. But to give you a simpler answer, I would say that there are several different ways, but the way that I looked at was self-report and parent report. So it's essentially looking at a questionnaire, and there are lots out there that are validated with children, and children or their parents or both, that's often better, are asked how frequently they experience certain experiences, emotions, and that gives us an idea of whether the anxiety that they're reporting is in line with what we'd expect for their development and their age and their sex, or whether it's not.
Really interesting. And what would you say if we have parents who are listening here, who are the parents of young children who stammer? What would you say to them? What's the best thing they can do to help?
I think that probably the first thing I say is that what you're doing would be brilliant, because the person that knows your child the best is you. And actually, I think that second guessing yourself is don't do that, because you know your child, you know what supports them. I think that we know that what's really important for children is feeling listened to. And so if it takes them a little bit longer to get out that sentence, doesn't matter. I mean, as long as that child feels as though they're being listened to, I think that that's probably the key. And the other thing I'd say is that lots of children know what helps them. And so I think having that time, as I'm sure all of you do, with them and asking them what helps them best is often the most empowering thing. Because once they've told us, or told you, you can make sure that everyone else around your child is doing the same thing, and they feel supported and heard, and that what they have to say has value, which it does. It always does.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm very aware of time, and I can see questions are coming in. So thank you very much for that. I'm just going to have a look at some of the questions we're getting in. We do have one saying, will there ever be a cure for stammering, stuttering? I think we kind of know the answer is no to that. But Kate, can I come back to you? Is stammering ever something that we can cure?
So I think the whole definition of cure is problematic, and what one person would consider a cure might be completely different to what someone else would say. And from my experience talking to people who stammer, what they are interested in is control, gaining control. Now, you and Jonathan might say, as people who have interiorized stammers or covert stammers, that maybe you have gained that control, but what I heard from Jonathan was that kind of came with a cost as well. So, I mean, I've heard discussions like this about cures for just about everything you can think of, and I'm dodging the question by saying I don't think we know what cure means. I think if someone wants to work on their fluency, there are potentially new ways that we can support that. Whether that would be something someone would consider a cure, I don't know.
And I actually have another question for you from Philip Riley. He says, does the training increase the connections between the speech and hearing parts of the brain? And if yes, does this increase the connection stay in place over time?
So I think what it does, what we've been able to show is that it does change the way that the brain functions after the training. And the changes in the brain that we see are in the same parts of the brain I mentioned earlier as the ones we suspect have a problem. These ones in the middle of the brain that control movement more generally. How long I think the brain is surprisingly plastic, even in adults. So we talk about how children have lots of capacity for change, and obviously our brain changes all the time, otherwise we wouldn't be able to learn. If the changes we saw in fluency perhaps weren't maintained, then I wouldn't expect the changes we saw in the brain to be maintained either. So they would go in parallel, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. And Caroline Hawley, who is a correspondent I work with in the newsroom, hello. She says, I'm the parent of a 10-year-old who stammers. His teacher says he seems to be slightly slower than his peers in getting down to language-heavy tasks, but with extra time he produces good work. Is there any research into language processing as well as language production challenges in kids who stammer? Ria, this might be one for you.
Yes, thank you for your question. So there certainly is research into language production and language development in children who stammer. It's not my area of specialism. I always like to say that at the start. What I would say is that there are some children who stammer, like all children who may have additional communication difficulties, which might include sort of delayed language, but it's no more likely than in other children. There's no evidence to suggest that there's a greater risk in children who stammer, and I think that's really important to remember. What I would say is it's really important that every child does develop at slightly different rates. And if you are concerned, definitely talk to the school and see if you can have a chat with a speech and language therapist would be my recommendation, if that's okay.
And I've got another question for you here, Ria. Have you observed a gender discrepancy in the risk for anxiety and depression in children?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because this is quite an exciting finding for us. So my last study, my PhD, looked at a big population study. So you might be familiar with the millennial cohort study, which is a big longitudinal study that looked at children's various physical, cognitive, and overall development who were born in the 2000s. And what we did find that was interesting is that when we looked at that big population, we were able to look at sex differences, and my research did find that that being female was associated with a slightly higher risk of increased anxiety, not depression, in children and young people, but mainly young people as they get older, which is in trend with non-stammering population.
And just one more, sorry, then I'll let you go. What effects can periods of isolation have on children, young people who stammer, thinking particularly about COVID and times like that? Do you think we've seen that being isolated has more of an impact on young people who stammer?
It's a really interesting question, because actually when we talk to young people in my capacity with the charity, but also in research, it's really varied as to what children and young people are reporting on that. I think that there is an argument that isolation isn't good for any young person, because it's really important that they have an opportunity to develop their social skills and social interaction. But I think that some young people, not having that opportunity to kind of interact, and when you have a stammer, it might make you more anxious going into situations because you have less practice. It's a bit like everything, really. It's a little bit like if you are unemployed for a period of time, you can become quite anxious about going back into the workplace. I think there's some similarities there, but there is some really interesting research that's for adults looking at the impact of COVID on children, the impact of COVID on the social and emotional kind of skills of people who stammer.
Thank you very much. And Jonathan, I was going to come to you for this one. Someone's just said, I've started seeing someone who has a stammer. Is there a good way to ask them about it, or should I hang back and wait for them to bring it up? What would your advice be?
Wow, that's I've never really thought about that question before. So here's the difficulty. We need to start from always recognizing that stammering disorder is like a category, and the kind of category it is a heterogeneous one. So when we ask for like a general answer, I always have to hesitate and sort of remember that actually this is an individual person that we're speaking about. And I suppose one thing that might be in the way of some kind of advice is kind of considering, does this person seem as though they have a stammer or a stammering disorder? Is this causing them any distress? Are they, that might be hard to detect, but I know that there's a distinction I want to rely on, which is between sort of primary and secondary symptoms. If a person's quite comfortable with their stammer, it might just be sort of almost effortless soft repetitions. They might just repeat on a sound, maintain eye contact, that sort of thing. Then you have the secondary symptoms associated with distress, where maybe you break eye contact, you're nodding, you're really tensing your muscles, you're forcing words out, maybe tapping your foot. Those sorts of things suggest that this person might not have the best relationship with their speech. I would suggest if a person doesn't have any secondary symptoms, if they're just a more disciplined speaker and they're quite comfortable with it, then probably we shouldn't make a big deal out of something that doesn't really bother them. If they are presenting those secondary symptoms and are presenting with sort of distress, the onus might be on them to open up to you when they're ready. But take that with a grain of salt.
Thank you very much. Max, I'm going to come to you for this one. Many adults use antidepressant drugs to control their stuttering in tough speaking situations, e.g. job interviews. What's the panel's thoughts about doing things like that?
With stuttering, there isn't, I mean, there's a bit of research on drugs with stuttering. Again, I'll advise it isn't my area. But the drug effects are unpredictable. Like one that's quite interesting is the rates of diagnosis onto ADHD for people who stutter is a little bit higher than chance. And with people who have ADHD, they often take a medication to reduce the impairment effects associated with ADHD. And there's a handful of case studies of this. Sometimes that medication will decrease the stuttering, sometimes it will increase the stuttering. And this is really the issue on drug effects on stuttering. It's very difficult to find a consistent effect. And it's kind of under researched as well. In general, it's good to stay away from medications if you don't really need to take them. So I can't remember exactly the phrasing of the question, but I would recommend keeping away from that stuff unless there's a prescription.
And there's another one here. My husband, his father, and my sons all have been stammerers, although it doesn't seem to have been passed on to my male grandchildren. Is there evidence of hereditary with stammering?
Yeah, I thought there wasn't anyone in my family who stuttered until I was talking to my great aunt, so my grandmother's sister, who said that her uncle was a bus conductor in London and he couldn't say Fulham, he'd stutter. And I was like, oh wow, there's another one. And it kind of skipped over several generations and landed on me. So the genetics of stuttering is really complex, and there's going to be an interaction of a lot of stuff, but there's very strong indication of a hereditary component in a lot of people who stutter, not in all people who stutter.
It's really interesting, isn't it? There's one more here. Kate, I wonder if you might answer this one. It says, I've recently been talking with a colleague who's been experiencing challenges with mutism. Some online searching has presented sites discussing stammering and mutism together. Is that something you've ever come across?
No, I haven't, except I do know, people may know George McGavin, who has done a lot of programs for the BBC, where he's a zoologist and has done lots of natural history programs and worked on the One Show, I think. He tells me that when he was a teenager, he did stop speaking for a year, and used to go around with a notebook and write down what he wanted to say. If you know him now, you probably haven't witnessed him stammering on TV, and he still does stammer, but much less than obviously how he did as a teenager that caused him to choose to stop. So it wasn't mutism, as in typically we're talking about, if we're talking about childhood mutism, even elective mutism, I think we're talking about children who really cannot speak. Now, the psychological pressure associated with stammer and all of the potentially negative experiences, I imagine, could cause somebody to become mute in that situation. But I don't know enough about. I don't think they're necessarily connected at a sort of biological level, if you're asking me that, but certainly at a psychological level, I could see how they could be.
Absolutely, it's interesting. Thank you very much. I think I'm very aware of the time, so I'm gonna call it a day there. But it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you all. Thank you so much for taking time out your day, and I hope it's been enlightening for people who've been listening as well. But we'll have to come back and talk about it again. There's so much more we can go into, isn't there? But thank you very much.
Thank you, Felicity.
Thanks
Thank you very much for having us.
Not at all, not at all.